A big hello and a warm welcome from Monticello. I'm Leslie Green Bowman, president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which has owned and operated this World Heritage Site since 1923. Our vision at Monticello is to bring history forward into national and global dialogues, and that is exactly what we are doing today with Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Jon Meacham and patriotic philanthropist and interviewer extraordinaire David Rubenstein. This is week 11 of our new live stream broadcasts. These conversations have now surpassed 250,000 views from around the country and the world. You can find out more about them on our Facebook page, Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, or on our website. Next week, you can join us on Thursday for a conversation between Thomas Jefferson and his rival, Alexander Hamilton. Today's program focuses on Jon Meacham's latest publication, a book he produced with Monticello called In the Hands of the People. It will be released next week, and in it, Jon has crafted a pocket manual of citizenship from the pen of Thomas Jefferson, reminding us all why our founding principles are still so important today. Jon Meacham is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author and presidential historian, a regular commentator on Morning Joe, and a contributing editor at Time. He holds the Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, and I might add, the chairmanship of Monticello's Board of Trustees. Interviewing Jon will be Monticello's generous benefactor, the patriotic philanthropist, David M. Rubenstein. David is the author of The American Story, Conversations with Master Historians, a book in which he captures the brilliance of our most celebrated historians, including Jon Meacham on Thomas Jefferson, and in which he profiles the nation's important figures from the founding forward. David is co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group, one of the world's largest and most successful private equity firms. He's also the host of the David Rubenstein Show on Bloomberg TV and PBS. But here at Monticello, we know him best for his transformational patronage, allowing us to complete restoration of Jefferson's Little Mountain and include the buildings, spaces, and stories of the enslaved families who labored here. David, it is my great pleasure to thank you and give you the screen.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you for the transformational work you have done at Monticello. I think without you and the board of trustees that you have, Monticello would not be in as good shape as it is today. And Jon, thank you for serving as the chairman of the board. Let me ask you a question about Thomas Jefferson at the outset. Yeah. You have written about many presidents, but you have spent 2 books now on Thomas Jefferson. So what is it that attracted you to Thomas Jefferson, that not only would you write 2 books about him, but serve as the chairman of the board of the organization that kind of runs Monticello, or does run Monticello?
Thank you, David, and thank you, Leslie. Jefferson is America, for better and for worse. The author of a transformational document that continues to shape lives around the world was also an unrepentant slave owner who was complicit in the perpetuation of our worst national sins. So you have the best of us and the worst of us all brought together. I remember going to see Lady Bird Johnson at the end of her life with our mutual friend Michael Beschloss some years ago. And here's a woman, in the motorcade in Dallas, there as the presidency reached the epic heights of the Great Society and civil rights and plummeted during the tragedy of Vietnam. And I said, ma'am, what do you take away from all of that experience? And she said, I've seen the best of us and I've seen the worst of us. And I think when you go to Monticello, when you engage with Jefferson, you see both sides. And I believe, which is easy for me to say, I'm a privileged, boringly heterosexual white Southern Episcopalian, so things tend to work out for me. But I believe that ultimately, history is a struggle. History is an unfolding story of fits and starts and action and reaction and push and pull. And by and large, we end up creating that more perfect union because of Jefferson's articulation of the essence of individual liberty.
John, when you were writing your first book on Thomas Jefferson, you told me earlier that you spent a night, I think, sleeping in Monticello just to kind of see what it was like. Did the ghosts of Thomas Jefferson ever show up at that night? Was it a little eerie sleeping there?
It was a little eerie. It was the closest I could get to interviewing Jefferson. I think that going to Monticello is the best way to have a conversation with Jefferson. Leslie gave me an air mattress. She wouldn't let me sleep on the bed. I'd like that to be on the record. And what was so remarkable was you realize that he had designed the house so that his quarters would be the first place the sun hit as the sun came up over the southwestern mountains. And if you, at the end of the day, if you go down to his grave, you will find that that's the last place where the sun shines on the mountain. So he was fundamentally a figure of optimism, fundamentally a figure of progress. He once said that the march of civilization has come over the continent, and where it stops, no one knows. And his view was that progress would not stop. And our mission as citizens, both as leaders and as followers, because in a republic, the followers enable the leaders. We create the climate of opinion that leads the kinds of folks that I write books about and that you interview to do what they can do. It's incumbent on us to try to take the ideals of that man who slept in those rooms and make them real.
So if you could interview Thomas Jefferson or have dinner with him, what one or two questions would you like to ask Thomas Jefferson after all these years of having studied him?
I would ask for more wine. I think that's the most important thing, and make sure he didn't drink all of it. I think the fundamental question would be, how did you square the circle? How did you articulate something so brilliantly and so compellingly that we're still sitting here 240 something years afterward talking about, and yet live with these contradictions and these unfulfilled promises? And I would warn people when they're quick to render judgments, moral judgments about people from the past, that my view anyway of the moral utility of history is not to look down condescendingly on the past or to look up at it adoringly, but to try to look it in the eye and see it for what it was, because we have to do that in our own time. We have to look around and see what are the issues, what are the concerns that for reasons of convenience we're not dealing with. And I think what I would ask Jefferson, particularly on matters of race, would be, why did you think, here's someone who could break away from the world's mightiest empire, someone who was fully willing to die during the revolution on the charge of treason, if it came to that. If he'd been caught at Monticello when Charlton had invaded Virginia, he might well have ended up in the Tower of London. You were willing to do these remarkable things. And yet, when it came to this enormous question of enslavement, you simply threw up your hands and thought of it as a tragedy. You recognize the moral dimensions, unquestionably. The wolf by the ears, I tremble when I realize that God is just. Well, you didn't just tremble in front of George III. So why did you just tremble when it came to this issue in front of the tribune of God?
Now, you are also working on a book on James Madison, a friend of Thomas Jefferson, and Dolly Madison, who also served as the hostess for Thomas Jefferson when he was president of the United States. His wife had already passed away. So why is it that you think that Madison, considered the father of the Constitution, isn't idealized or lauded as much in history as Thomas Jefferson has been? Why? Because the Constitution, you could say, is a more important document than the Declaration of Independence, which is important, but it's not the governing document of our country. So why is it that Madison hasn't really captured the public attention in quite the way that Jefferson has?
Well, Jefferson wrote the mission statement, right? He wrote the poetry of the American experiment. Madison wrote the prose. And Jefferson, and one of the virtues of this book, I think, is that his prose, even now, jumps off the page. You want to read it out loud. You want to listen to it. You want to bathe in it in many ways. Madison didn't write that well. He wrote more like, though he wasn't a lawyer, he wrote more like a lawyer. He wrote kind of like an 18th century theologian to some extent. So it's harder to recapture Madison's poetry amid his prose. Jefferson's prose was poetic.
Now, when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, did he realize that a sentence in the preamble would become the most famous sentence in the English language? And
no, he didn't. He thought the most important parts were the details of the indictment against George III and the government in London. That was what much of the work was about on the floor of the Continental Congress. That arduous editing. Those of us who are writers know that editing is a necessary evil, sometimes more evil than necessary. And that's what happened to Jefferson. Poor Benjamin Franklin had to calm Jefferson down because he was so agitated by the various suggestions. But his sense was that he was writing a case. He was writing the case for breaking away. And one of the fascinating moments to me, the dramas of American life, is why we declared independence when we did. It would have made a lot more sense when you think about it emotionally to have done it in April or May of 1775, right after Lexington conquered, blood on the ground, spirits were high, but it took a while for public opinion to ripen. And Jefferson was able, in those critical sentences that we think of, to articulate this ideal of human liberty. The most important edit probably was he had initially written that instead of saying that they were certain inalienable rights, that they were self-evident, he'd written that they were sacred and inalienable. And Franklin suggested changing sacred to self-evident because it took it away from the realm of theology and put it more in the realm of Enlightenment philosophy.
why is that sentence so famous? The sentence from the Declaration of Independence now is seen as the symbol and the creed of our country, I guess. But why is it? What is it that he did in that one sentence that made it so famous?
He crystallized what had been unfolding for 3 or 4 centuries in Western life. When you think about the tributaries that led into Philadelphia, what's going on? Gutenberg, the introduction of movable type, which democratized information, the translation of sacred scripture into the vernacular, the Protestant Reformations, the scientific revolution, the European Enlightenment, an entire reorientation of the world from being seen as vertical, that is, popes and princes and prelates and kings, who either by an accident of birth or an incident of election were given authority over all of us, was becoming more horizontal, that in fact we were born with the capacity to determine our own destinies. And I think what he crystallized, and the reason it echoes through the language of Lincoln, the language of Dr. King, the language unto this hour of people who fully understand the possibilities of the country, the reason it resonates is because it's as King said at the March on Washington, it's a promissory note. It is empowering to us, and it enables us to go into the arena of the life of the nation, but also of our own lives as agents of ourselves, as opposed to agents of kings or popes.
So Jefferson lived, as did Adams, 50 years after that document was written. Did Jefferson actually realize how significant that sentence was during his lifetime? And did he take great pride in having written it, as opposed to his initial concern that it had not been adequately regarded by the other members of the Continental Congress?
He did a very good job of what we would, what former presidents, whom I know you know well, sometimes think of as the legacy project. He was aware as the years went by that the poetry of the Declaration would endure. It drove John Adams crazy. A lot drove John Adams crazy. It didn't take much to set him off. But he actually, there's a letter of Adams's about how the revolution, the glory of the revolution had gone entirely to Jefferson. The glory of the Declaration, he had run off with it. Adams, like any lawyer, actually thought that the more significant thing and what should be celebrated was not July 4th and the Declaration, but I think I'm right, the July 2nd resolution that ordered or enabled the state governments to reorganize. Only a lawyer would think that in order to reorganize a state government would become the source for firecrackers and great celebrations. But by the end, Jefferson knew that so much of his legacy was going to be wrapped up in the Declaration. Famously, as we know, one of the three achievements on the tombstone there at Monticello, not far from where Leslie is the author of the Declaration of Independence, the Virginia Resolution for Religious Liberty, and a founder of the University of Virginia. All achievements that had to do with freedom and the life of the mind.
So as we talk today, there is a look at people like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, people who've been known as heroes of our country for a long time. And there are proposals to tear down monuments to them or do other things because they were slave owners. How do you respond to that? And how do you think is the appropriate way to look at these historic figures who were slave owners?
Yeah, my test on this is pretty straightforward. And I first published this right after the neo-Nazi violence in Charlottesville 3 years ago now, almost 3 years ago. I think that the test of a public figure in terms of being commemorated on public land, so I'm not talking about your house, I'm not talking about your yard, I'm not talking about churches or schools, but on public land that belongs to all of us, should be, were you devoted to the journey toward a more perfect union? You may have been sinful, you may have been flawed, you may have had enormous failings, but on balance, were you in fact a force to continue the constitutional experiment that led to the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, that led to a government that got to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act? If you took up arms against that government and tried to end that experiment, I don't think you belong in public places of veneration. And so, and again, I'm a graduate of the University of the South. I live in Nashville. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. You know, I know this as well as I know anything. Having monuments to Confederate figures is basically memorializing the end of the American experiment, not its continuation. So however flawed Washington was, however flawed Jefferson was, however flawed Jackson was, the debate we should have should be, were they in fact figures that continued a constitutional experiment that has led us to a better place or not? The other thing on the whole business of commemoration, the mechanics of memory, is instead of being subtractive, I think the conversation is a bit more productive if we think in more additive terms. I don't think there's anything more American, anything, than the fact that Thomas Jefferson and Martin Luther King now stare at each other across the tidal basin in perpetuity. So there should be monuments to the people who were powerless as well as to the powerful.
As we talk today, there has been an effort to tear down the Andrew Jackson statue that's in Lafayette Park. You are a native of Tennessee. You won a Pulitzer Prize for your book on Andrew Jackson. How do you contrast Jackson's views on slavery with Jefferson's views on slavery, if at all?
Well, no, they're pretty close. Jackson was a defender and perpetuator of African-American slavery. He was the chief architect of Native American removal, unquestionably. My argument about Jackson is, if you, and this applies to Jefferson and others as well too, if you think that by pulling down a monument or banishing someone from the historical memory and the historical sphere will lead to redemption, you are in fact, I think, letting the nature of the country itself off the hook. Andrew Jackson and Thomas Jefferson represented the extreme edge of a mainstream, but they were within that mainstream in their time. And we have seen again and again how the perennial forces of nativism, racism, isolationism, tribalism, all of these forces are, sometimes they ebb and sometimes they flow, but they are in fact the forces that shape all of us. And I think it's a little too glib, honestly, to think that the destruction of a statue or the banishment of a person somehow or another redeems the past. The work has to be looking at the past, realizing that someone like Andrew Jackson, who strengthened the Union, who put down nullification, which might have been a precursor to secession in 1832-33, he preserved the Union, a Union that was imperfect, but it was a Union that Lincoln was willing to save. And I would recommend to everybody who's dealing with these issues, and we all are now, go read Frederick Douglass's oration on the erection of the Lincoln Monument at the Freedmen's Monument, it was called, in Washington. It's the most intelligent and moving biographical meditation that I think I know. And it's Douglass talking about Lincoln, basically saying, Lincoln was not our president. He was preeminently the white man's president. But in the end, when the crisis came, he helped us. And therefore, he is worth commemorating so that we will remember someone who did the right thing in the last extremity. I wish history were more of a fairy tale. I wish it were less complicated, but it isn't. And I don't think we serve ourselves by pretending somehow or another that there is an entirely good force and an entirely evil force.
Let's talk about your new book on citizenship and Thomas Jefferson's views on citizenship. Did he think it was important for everybody to be involved in helping to govern the country, or just a few elite people at the top?
No, he believed in the broad populace, and we have to stipulate his racial views and his gender views as well. He believed that, as he put it, men should be a participator in politics, not just on election day, but every day. He believed fundamentally that in this Republican lowercase r idea that ultimately the broad popular wisdom would get it right with enough time and enough effort. He said, given enough time, the people will set things to rights. And I do think that's the lesson of our history.
What about the right to vote? Did he think that at least all people should have the right to vote, or is it important to vote? And how did he justify not having African Americans vote, women vote, and so forth?
Well, it's a classic Jeffersonian argument. He was willing to accept a limited view of suffrage, but once he limited it, he saw it as universal and essential. And that's very unsatisfactory to our ears. But to him, the suffrage was absolutely essential, because the implications of the Declaration, which found more codification in the Constitution, was that in a free and popular government, every person had to be empowered and become a soldier in many ways of democracy. And so there had to be constant attention to public affairs. There had to be personal virtue, because a republic is the sum of its parts. We're only able to do on a broad level what we're willing to do on a specific one. And so the art of citizenship, in his view, it was a belief in the possibilities of freedom, a belief in the obligations of citizenship and of neighborliness, very important to him. You know, he always wanted his friends to move to Albemarle County. He loved having his people around him as much as possible. And he saw that as a microcosm of what the larger republic could be.
Now, what about religious freedom? Was he a big believer in that? And why were his views on religion somewhat challenged by other people?
He was not a conventional Christian believer. There's a huge debate about whether he was a deist or where he fit. There was a vicious political atmosphere under which he worked. This idea that somehow another Twitter and cable news just created all of this is crazy. He was attacked as an infidel. In 1796, the first time he stood for president against John Adams, there were newspapers in the North that said, you can either have Adams and God or Jefferson and no God. And so that was very much part of the political climate of the time. He was an early adopter, if you will, of religious liberty. He saw it as of a piece with individual liberty, the idea of an established church, the idea that your civil rights would be inextricably linked to your professions and confession publicly of religion were anathema to him. He shared that with James Madison. And one of the great insights, really, of the American Revolution was religious liberty. We tend to take it for granted now, interestingly, but remember the world they were coming from. It was a world where people fought over the nature of transubstantiation. Blood had been shed over the questions about theology. And so the American founders were largely unified, not in their lack of belief, but in their compelling belief that people should be free to choose to believe or not.
Now, there's a story that you can probably tell us if it's true, that because Jefferson's views on Christianity were not maybe the same as others, that when he offered to sell his library to the Library of Congress after the Library of Congress's library was burned during the War of 1812, that many members of Congress said, we don't want to take the whole library because some of his books might be sacrilegious, and they actually went through each book to make sure it was okay. Is that true or not?
Right. Yeah, no. And in the infidel charge followed him throughout his career. He went through, he tried to create his own Bible, tried to take the miracles out of the Bible and make it more of the Jefferson Bible, which is still broadly used in Washington, is an attempt to do the life and I think it's right, the morals and life of Jesus of Nazareth. He was trying to recover what he believed to be the primitive message of Christianity as opposed to the ecclesiastical and more theological one. But I think one of his central achievements, and again with Madison, was this idea that you could not coerce belief. Belief coerced is no belief at all. And it's simply obedience. And obedience was something, if there is a unifying theme in his political philosophy, by and large, it is that we should unshackle ourselves from blind obedience, from superstition, from political tribalism. We're living with a form of this right now. Our partisanship is so ambient now that it's been argued by some people that, in fact, partisanship has become a new kind of religion. Parties have their own martyrs, their own pastors, their own holy books, their own churches, so to speak, whether it's a network or different kinds of precincts of passion. And Jefferson, I think, at his best, though he was a ferocious partisan, he always affected not to be, but that's part of the vernacular of the time, was those who wanted power had to pretend they didn't want it. But I believe that a full reading of Jefferson leads you to a place where we have to put reason instead of passion at the center of our political and public concerns.
Now, what did Jefferson think about the importance of educating citizens? Did he think that it was important to have an educated citizenry if we were going to have a good democracy? And what does the phrase Jeffersonian democracy really mean?
Well, Jeffersonian democracy is in contrast, I think, by and large, to Hamiltonian governance. We're still working on getting a Jefferson musical. If you have any rap lyrics, David, I think you should share them with the group. And I remember going to see Chris Christie when I'd written the Jefferson book. He had very kindly called up and wanted to talk about Jefferson. And so I went to see him. He was still governor of New Jersey then. And the first thing he said was, I'm really more of a Hamilton guy. Now, when people say they're more of a Hamilton guy, what they really mean is they're an investment banker. That tends to be it. But without thinking about it, I said, Governor, at least my guy didn't get shot in Jersey. And then the damnedest thing happened. I couldn't get back into the city. All the bridges were closed. So it was a small unknown part of that story. Hamiltonian governance was much closer to the British form. Hamilton had proposed a president for life at the Constitutional Convention. much more interested in aristocratic forms, in the centrality of governance. Jefferson very much believed that the state should have a more of a proportionate role than the national government. That has presented innumerable problems through the years. And it's easy to say that Hamilton won that argument. That's rather complicated because, again, Hamilton wanted something that would not really look like our democracy in a way that if Jefferson wanted too much, Hamilton wanted too little. I think one of the great things about the country is that we had the two of them arguing away. At Monticello, there's a bust of Jefferson in one corner of the front hall and one of Hamilton. And Jefferson is reputed to have remarked, there we are, opposing each other in death as we did in life. Education was the lifeblood of what he wanted for the country. Again, if a republic is the sum of its parts, if the elements create the compound, you needed people who were able to reach reasoned, data-driven, enlightened conclusions about the panoply of public problems.
Now, we know so much about Jefferson's views because he wrote a lot of letters, but how could it be that we have all these letters? I mean, how did he manage to keep the letters he was sending, and what was his system for making certain that his letters were preserved?
I am not a great technological genius here, but he had an early kind of Xerox machine or carbon paper. And it's there in the house, and there are better people than me to talk about it. But he kept copies of his correspondence, so he knew what was going out, and obviously he had what was coming in. Important for history, also very practical, because if he sent a letter and that letter ended up in the newspaper, which tended to happen, it could be changed. So if he had a copy, he could prove that someone might have turned it into fake news.
He was such a gifted writer, people would say, but why was he unwilling to speak in public very much? At the Second Continental Congress, he never actually spoke against the changes that were being made. And as president, I think he only made one public speech, his first inaugural address. Why was he so afraid of speaking in public?
He wasn't good at it. And like a lot of very talented people, he actually understood what he was good at and what he wasn't good at. You're right. He could barely be heard in the first inaugural. He did away with the public presentation of the State of the Union, the annual message, as it was called then. No one went to Congress. No president went to Congress until Woodrow Wilson to deliver the State of the Union, because Jefferson did not like that form of public performance. Now, I think we could probably be fancy about it and say he worried about demagoguery, he worried about a cult of personality. I think the explanation is probably a little more prosaic. I think he simply was not a good public speaker, and so therefore he maximized what he was good at and minimized what he wasn't so good at.
So what was his view on immigration? Was it important to have immigration? And was his mother not an immigrant?
Yeah, well, the Randolphs were never immigrants. We don't say that. I'm married to one, so we're very careful about that. The founding generation understood that immigration was essential. It was both economically wise. It was would turn out to be culturally important. The reaction against immigration in 1798 with the passing of the Alien Acts and then the Sedition Act, which basically outlawed dissent, was really the first great political crisis, in addition to the Jay Treaty and some other the other cataclysmic events of the 1790s, which, if you think the past was placid, just go read what unfolded in the 1790s all the way through. But the Sedition Act, the Alien Act and the Sedition Act led Jefferson and Madison to draft what became the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which argued that Madison's was a little more moderate, Jefferson's was a little more conservative, as we would say now, actually laid the groundwork for a kind of nullification, for the idea that states had the right and the duty to step in when the federal government ran unreasonably away from what could be a kind of governing center. And the fact that immigration was at the center of that first great debate, I think, is unsurprising, but it's striking, given that we have had seasons of these debates from the 1790s, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the 1924 Act, which shut down immigration in many ways. The 1924 Act controlled the flow of folks into the country until 1965, when Lyndon Johnson signed a bill that nobody really remembers or talks about very much, but which created the conditions for this rapidly changing demography of the nation we're seeing now.
So many times people who are famous get credit for things they may not have done. But did Thomas Jefferson really design Monticello? Was he the architect, or did he hire somebody and he just pretended he was the architect?
No, I think he. I think he. But it's so. Leslie won't like this. There are parts of the house that are so impractical, only an amateur could have done them. I think about the dome room at the very top, which is lovely and totally pointless. Again, there are wonderful people at Monticello who are currently screaming at their screens. Monticello was like the country itself, was an unfolding project. It was a constant construction project. I have joked behind your back, and happy to do it with you, that if Jefferson had had a David Rubenstein, he might have actually finished the house at some point before 1826. So the house today that you go see, socially distanced and wear your mask and register and all that, the house today is in many ways, I think, in better shape than at any time, certainly since Jefferson, and maybe even when he was resident there.
So is Monticello open today for physical visiting?
It is. Leslie and her team have done amazing work at managing the flow of people, so that it's all safe. There are virtual tours, which are wonderful. What I would say is do virtual tours and then come very safely to Monticello. Encounter the Jefferson story, encounter the Hemings story, which are inextricably linked. The life of Jefferson and the life of the enslaved population are of immense importance in understanding not just what was real then, but in many ways it illuminates the issues that we are grappling with anew at this hour. And don't condemn Jefferson out of hand. Don't celebrate him mindlessly, but take him for what he was, a mortal man who was doing what he could by his lights. And remember that that's what all of us are. We're mortal, hopefully trying to do the best we can by our lights. And let's learn from his failures as opposed to wagging our finger.
Now, you mentioned Hemings, and you're referring to Sally Hemings. And for those who may not know, the foundation you chaired for many years did not acknowledge that Jefferson had a relationship with her. But in recent years, the foundation has. Who was Sally Hemings, and what was the nature of that relationship in your view?
Well, 22 years ago, roughly, the foundation undertook a DNA test to establish whether there was a scientific reason to believe what many people, including my colleague and friend and fellow board member Annette Gordon-Reed, had believed without benefit of DNA evidence, which was that Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman at Monticello, who we believe was the half-sister of Jefferson's wife. So she was the daughter of Jefferson's father-in-law, and who, as a very young woman, had gone to Paris with one of Jefferson's daughters when he was minister to France. He accompanied her there. Our best sense from Madison Hemings, one of their children, from his oral history on this, which you can see rendered when everything's open at Monticello, was that Jefferson began, and the vernacular here is very tricky. Is it a relationship if you're an enslaved person? Is it a liaison? What the vernacular is hard. But there was a sexual relationship that ran from what we can tell, I'll say what I believe, based in many ways on what Annette's foundational work, that lasted 40 years. It was an enormously long connection. A number of children were born of that union. And Jefferson was, one of the fascinating things to me about him is he didn't believe, he professed not to believe, that the America we have today could come into being, that an integrated, largely integrated, diverse, ethnically, racially diverse nation could be a possibility in the world. And yet he was creating just that kind of world at Monticello. There were visitors to the house who would be struck by the resemblance between people who were waiting at table and Mr. Jefferson, suggesting, of course, that his children continued to be enslaved. What Sally Hemings did was she said she wanted to stay in Paris and seek her freedom there in the 1780s. And in what I sometimes think of as the Treaty of Paris, this remarkably brave young woman talking to one of the most famous men in the world, a statesman, a diplomat, a future president, strikes a deal. She says, I'll go back to Virginia with you, but any children that we have must be freed at the age of 21. And she had the courage in that time and place to negotiate with someone infinitely more powerful than she was.
And Jefferson honored that commitment.
He did.
And today, if you visit Monticello, can you see where people believe that Sally Hemings lived?
Yeah, the Hemings. Leslie will tell us whether it's open in pandemic time, but it's a remarkable achievement in the art of restoration and preservation. And for people who think that somehow another history is incommensurate to this moment, I recommend the story of the way Monticello has investigated, reconciled with, and commemorated the Hemings story. It's genuinely remarkable. What they believe to be her bedroom, you can stand there, you and I have stood there together. And the story, largely drawn from Madison Hemings' oral history, tells this story. One of the things, and just quickly, that I owe Annette Gordon-Reed for this point, for centuries, the Hemings story was actually publicized in 1802, I think, by a disaffected journalist and former ally of Jefferson's. And it was denied for 190 something years by a prevailing white culture. And I remember reading Annette's first book on this. It was called Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson in American Controversy. And she makes a point in there about, because a lot of the white folks would say, this is just oral history. We can't credit it.
Right.
And Annette made the wonderful point that why do we credit the contrary oral history? So if the white world says this didn't happen, that somehow as oral history is more credible than the African-American history where they said it did happen. And it's just an immensely complicated, rich, fascinating, heartbreaking story. And Annette's book, The Hemingses of Monticello, is one of the great achievements of our time. It won the Pulitzer. Annette's the most decorated historian of our time. And she's really nice, so it's really annoying.
So, John, let me ask you a final question, which is, why should somebody visit Monticello? Will you learn more about citizenship if you visit Monticello? And what has your study of Thomas Jefferson taught you about the value of citizenship?
I think you go to Monticello and you engage with Jefferson if you want to engage with the best America can be and the worst it's capable of. And it's not a fairy tale. There are no rides. There's no sugarcoating of the history, quite the opposite. It's not a celebratory house. It's not a mindlessly celebratory experience. It's a very engaging and serious-minded exploration of the immense complexities of American life. And I return to Jefferson again and again. I'm writing about his best friend now, Madison, mainly because here was this remarkably intellectually gifted man who was capable of enormous good and yet was willing to essentially, to use a colloquial phrase, take a dive on the hardest question of that time and of this time. So this isn't some liberal media, just discovering that Jefferson had a problem with race. This is not that. Monticello has undertaken serious, scholarly, preservationist work to present this incredibly important part of American history to an audience, to people who, I think if you walk those grounds and you walk those halls, it's not that it's overwhelmingly monumental. What's striking is that you can envision life unfolding in this place. And life is the details of daily life and the compromises we all make in the course of daily and political life is the stuff of history. President Kennedy once said that the important point of all biography is to answer the question, what was he really like? Or what was she really like? And if you want to know what Thomas Jefferson was really like and what America was and is really like, go to Monticello.
Jon, thank you very much for an interesting conversation, and thanks for what you're doing to preserve the traditions of Monticello.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it.